This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
I don't know, every audience that I talk to has different interests. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to get a sense of what you would like to hear. The subject of Jesus is very, very broad. And there are about 20 different chapters and 20 different theories that I have in the book. What got me interested in the subject was when I wrote The Gods of Eden, one of the chapters dealt with Jesus and the connection to the UFO phenomenon. At the time that I was writing that, I was hearing all these other different theories about Jesus. One that he never existed at all, the one that's popular now that he was married and had children, and there are probably another, more than a dozen more that I'd heard. And so I thought it'd be very interesting to finally take the time to look into all of these theories, because in my own mind I felt like I really wanted to get some sense, was Jesus really real? If he wasn't, I'd better hurry up and change what I wrote about him in Gods of Eden. If he was real, at least in my own mind, I thought it'd be good just to bring all the information together and save everybody a lot of time. It takes so much time to find the books, read the books about his missing years, whether he really died on the cross, and if he didn't die, what did he do? I came across other theories about his connections to England through his mother. All these things were just quite fascinating, and the surprising thing about it is that there's evidence for just about all of it, and also what did he look like, too. I had an opinion already in Gods of Eden of what he looked like, but then I also heard the theory that he might have been a black man, and there's actually some evidence for that. So for me, it was really the challenge of researching this as much as I could, bringing it all together, putting it into one book, and giving the main evidence in support of each chapter. And then out of that, then I formed at least my opinions. Some of my opinions come through in the book, but mostly I try to leave it up to the reader this time as to what to believe. The Gods of Eden was more of a unified theory that I then presented the evidence for. Here, it's really just different theories with the evidence. And out of that, to me anyway, a picture emerges of a very complex man. I do believe that he did exist. How many people, I met a few of my readers of Gods of Eden. How many people here have read that book? Okay, just several. I won't go too much into it then, because I think if I get into that, I could easily spend the next hour just talking about that theory. And I think most of you are probably here because you heard this was about Jesus. One of the longest chapters in the current book is about Jesus and the ancient astronaut. And it has all the evidence about the UFO connection to Jesus, plus a lot more. So what I'll do is maybe I'll kind of, out of memory, I'll try to recite the theories that I present. I'll give you a little synopsis of what they are. And then I'd like to hear from you. Which of these theories would you like to hear more about? And also, what's your reaction to some of these theories? The book is really controversial, and I've got to warn people about that too. It's even more controversial in some ways than Gods of Eden was, some of the material in there. When you study the Bible, I'm not Christian, I'm not Jewish, I don't belong to any religion, in fact. When you study it, there's some the things that really intrude on your comfort zone. And there were a couple of times when I was sort of squirming when I was writing this book, saying, well, should I really put this in the book? But I think as a researcher and as a person who tries to take a more academic approach to things, you pretty much put everything on the table. And you just kind of say, this is what it is, this is the evidence, but then you decide. One thing, too, that I think that's very important, too, about this book is that I don't try to use the Bible to support my own beliefs or my own moral beliefs or anything like that. Which many people do. One thing that I came to the conclusion is that, I'm going to start getting controversial right now, is I think the human race actually has a higher morality, actually practices a higher morality than what's in the Bible. And this is a very controversial idea because we're taught by the Christians that the Bible represents the highest morality that there is. But in fact, if you look at the Old Testament, it says that slavery is okay. If you're one of God's chosen people, you can own slaves. If you're one of God's chosen people, it's okay to go out and commit genocide against the people who are not chosen. It's okay to have these horrible death sentences where you stone people to death. I mean, what an awful way to execute people. And we've moved away from that, I think, as a race, and I think that's very positive. So that's one thing, too, I think it's very important to stress, is that even when we talk about biblical morality, it's not necessarily a morality that we want to follow. Sometimes it is. Sometimes there are some very good points in there that we should follow. Other times it isn't. And therefore, I think using our own guidelines, I think, is very important. Okay, so the theories that I cover here, and let me go ahead and start with the first theory is that Jesus just never existed at all. And that's actually a fairly widespread idea, that he was based solely on some of the sun myths. He was based on Mithra. There are all kinds of crucified saviors that existed earlier that he's very similar to. And the story of Jesus follows the patterns very, very closely to some of those, especially the Mithraic religion, which Paul, the Apostle Paul, was very familiar with. Okay, so we have this whole theory that he didn't exist. And I devote a whole chapter to it. My editor, Elizabeth, when she read through it, she called me after she read that chapter, and she says, you know, I don't even want to read the rest of your book. I'm so convinced he didn't exist. Why should I bother with all these other theories? And it is very convincing, because what many of you probably already know is they didn't start writing about Jesus until at least 20 years after he was supposed to have lived. And some of the Gospels may be even longer than that. They could be as long as 50 years after. And by the time they wrote them, Paul and the people around him were already preaching a certain idea about Jesus. They already had this whole thing that they were talking about. And what they wrote in the Gospels were all written by people who were surrounded by Paul, who surrounded Paul. And so, of course, they wrote about what they were already teaching. And so here's the idea that they wanted to have a savior to give to the Jewish people, because the Romans were already worshiping this god Mithra, and they didn't want the Jews to go start following Mithra. So what we're going to do is we're going to give them a similar kind of savior, but he's going to be Jewish. So you don't have to follow Mithra. You can go ahead and just follow our made-up savior named Jesus. And he has all the same wonderful attributes that Mithra has, so don't follow Mithra, even though you're living in the Roman Empire. That was sort of the idea behind the idea that Jesus didn't exist. He was just an invention. And I'll tell you, you cannot prove that Jesus existed. That is what amazed me when I finally got through this. There's no absolute proof that he existed. None of the writings, there's nothing that we have physically. There's no writing that absolutely proves his existence. And that's where some people leave it. They say, okay, he just wasn't real at all. Then where did we get him? Okay, Mithra is one of them. There's another theory that I talk about that was very controversial, and that is that he was just based on the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms. This was John Allegro, who was very famous for his work on the Dead Sea Scrolls. John Allegro was really a hero to a lot of people, because he got the Dead Sea Scrolls known, but then he wrote this book where he says, well, Jesus never existed. All it was were these people who were taking these hallucinogenic mushrooms. And Jesus was just a metaphor for hallucinogenic mushrooms. And the bread of the Bible is, in fact, these mushrooms that people were taking. And he was published by a big publisher, and it caused this uproar. And the poor guy, his career tanked after that. And the publisher withdrew the book. They apologized for even having published the book. And I don't know how much longer John Allegro lived after that, but his career was never the same. And so I get into that, and the point that I make about that is, yeah, I don't think, I kind of agree with the skeptics on that. I don't think Jesus was just a metaphor for mushrooms. But there was mushroom use. And you get into the symbols like the Christmas tree. And there's a wonderful little book called, I forget what it was called. It was, you can still buy it. anyway, it talks about that, about how the Christmas tree was actually a pagan symbol, and that this hallucinogenic mushroom, it was actually red and white, and it grows under pine trees. And of course, you have all these hallucinations, and it causes a sense of resurrection. And these are true things. And so it is possible that some of the pagan ideas that got grafted onto Christianity did arise out of mushroom use. Okay. So that.
Old Christmas cards.
Pardon me?
All those old Christmas cards.
Yeah, yeah. And so that was a funny theory. I had a lot of fun writing that chapter. And then there's the theory that he was a man called Apollonius of Tyana. Now, Apollonius was a real figure. He was a mystic who traveled. He was very famous in his day. He was footloose, just like Jesus was. He walked around. He had his band of disciples. He had his closest disciple with him. And in fact, the writings of Apollonius and the people who wrote about him never wrote about Jesus. And some people use that as evidence that Jesus didn't exist. It was really Apollonius. Again, my conclusion is that probably not. Probably Apollonius was who he was, and Jesus was somebody different. But again, it kind of gives us an insight into what was going on back in those days, these footloose preachers who were running around preaching. Okay, then you get into the theory, which I subscribe to, but you don't have to. And again, I try to leave it in the book. It's up to you, that he was just a man buried under myth, that he was a true individual. But the people who were starting a religion based on him already had an idea of what they wanted to do with him. And now you get into theories about that he was sort of controlled by a cabal of Essenes who made him follow a certain life path that led to his crucifixion. And there are all kinds of theories about that, but basically that he was real. And that's my conclusion. But again, some people don't follow that. Then, okay, if he's real, then who was he? What did he teach? We get into what kind of Jew was he? Okay, the idea that he was Jewish. Was he an Essene? Was he a Sadducee? Was he a Pharisee? And basically, by process of elimination, the Pharisees, we know he spoke out against them, calling them hypocrites. The Sadducees were the royalty. The Essenes were the more metaphysical, the people who traveled around in simple, well, they didn't travel around so much, they were in their enclaves, but they wore the simple white robes, and they were the most similar to Jesus. And so we have the very common theory that he was an Essene. Probably was. I think there's very good evidence for that. Where that gets me interested is I'm mostly interested in what he taught. I'm mostly interested in what was his message of salvation. What did he think the soul was all about? What did he think that God was about, and all of that? And as soon as you start thinking he was an Essene, and you look at what the Essenes believed, it's totally different than what we read in the New Testament. The Essenes believed that bodies were bad, that souls need to escape bodies. It's sort of like the Eastern idea of escaping reincarnation, to not keep reincarnating. That the freed soul will leave the body and escape, which is very different than the Pauline idea that the body is the temple of the soul, which is more common today. This is really the belief that most people hold today, that it's more of a temple as opposed to a prison or something bad. So anyway, so now we're starting to get a little disconnect. Now we're starting to see, well, is Christianity really what Jesus taught? And that doesn't necessarily mean that what Jesus taught is the truth either, and here I'm going to be controversial again. In my point of view, I don't try to interpret Jesus in ways to fit my ideas. When I first started the book, I really didn't care that much what Jesus taught, because I'm not Christian, I'm not Jewish. It doesn't really matter. It's interesting. But there's so much now because of what's happening with Christianity, the role it's playing in politics, the way it's being used now. I think it's starting to become important to really understand, is this really what Jesus taught? And what should we think about what we're being told about it? Okay, then that leads to another theory that Jesus was a Gnostic. And now we're getting into really, even Pope Paul spoke out against it. He wrote against the Gnostics even before he died. Pope Paul II wrote this book, and he's saying, well, the New Age is really dangerous because it's teaching these old Gnostic ideas. It's reviving the old Gnostic ideas. And the Gnostics taught something very similar, that the universe is an evil place, that all matter, including bodies, are evil, and that we need to escape that as opposed to cherishing it and being part of it. Very different than Christian beliefs, and even the beliefs of many non-Christians who have a spiritual orientation. And so the question for me is then, okay, is this true? A, that Jesus taught it. We have all these Gospels that were found at Nag Hammadi saying that he did teach that. And if so, is that true? I mean, is there a danger to us as souls reincarnating? Is there a danger to us as souls to stay in this universe and to keep going along as we're going? As you can tell, I have a very spiritual orientation. I believe these things. And then I kind of talk about a little bit, in terms of our existence on planet Earth, we know Earth is doomed anyway. In 2 billion years, the astronomers have said that the Andromeda galaxy is going to collide with the Milky Way, and no matter, we can't do anything about that. So the question is, and it could happen by some other means sooner than that. So what does that mean for us as souls? If we really are eternal, immortal souls that go from body to body, that we've existed for basically a very, very long time, that means that probably we were somewhere 2 billion years ago doing something, maybe not all of us together, but we were doing something, which means 2 years from now, we're going to be doing something. We're going to be doing something. And it seems kind of silly to think about this maybe. A lot of people have told me, well, either humanity will have wiped itself out or we'll have reached other galaxies by then anyway, so it's not anything worth thinking about. But to me, it kind of raised the question, well, then maybe there are hazards to continuing to be involved in the universe. And astronomy just teaches us that. And also the universe itself, some astronomers think it's just going to collapse into some massive black hole. Now, that's even further away. So I think, well, geez, if that happens, I as a soul, I sure don't want to be here anymore. And I don't want to be here when that happens, if it happens. So then the Gnostic point of view suddenly, for me, took on more urgency. I mean, it became, I think, more interesting to me. And therefore, it became more interesting to me whether or not Jesus was teaching that as well. And that is one of the main things that almost destroyed the church in the beginning, were the battles between the Gnostics, who were teaching the idea that there are perils to being in the universe, versus the Pauline Christians who said, no, there are no perils, you're okay, this is God's creation. And you're safe here. And the religious scholars talk about how this was the main fight, the main theological fight in the first few centuries of Christianity's existence, and it almost destroyed Christianity. We know which side won. The Pauline version won, of course, Apostle Paul and what we call Orthodoxy today. That's what won. But was that really what Jesus taught? And that, to me, is in many ways the most interesting question. Okay, from there, then we get into other theories about what did Jesus look like. And there was this funny article in Popular Mechanics, I think, where they said the real Jesus, and they had some professor who just made a model of what he thought a typical Palestinian from that era would look like. And they printed this picture, and they said, Jesus revealed. I don't know if that's the exact headline, but the face of Jesus, here it is. And I was so excited when I saw that. So I opened it up, and here was this guy who looked like a caveman, and I couldn't believe it. And all he did was just say, well, he must have had very parched skin because he was a carpenter, and the average height of people was such and such in those days. So it had nothing to do with actual descriptions of Jesus other than an assumption he must have had, been very sunburned. And that was about it. So anyway, so there's a theory that he was a black man, and that became very popular in the black community. There's an old coin that was actually made just a few hundred years after Jesus' life, where he does look very much like a black man on the coin. And there's some other evidence. There's the Black Madonna statues. I think most of you know about those over in Europe, where you have the Black Madonna and the black baby. And so it seemed to be a common belief back then that Jesus was black and his mother was black. Now, the thing that goes against that theory, I'm not going to spoil it for you. There's another point of view on that. Read my book and I'll tell you. Okay. Oh, about the,
Why the book? Can you say it?
pardon me?
Can you say what you were just saying?
Okay, well, the Black Madonna may not have been Madonna. It may have been the servant Sarah. There was a tradition in France that Mary Magdalene, possibly Mother Mary, and Joseph of Arimathea, and a bunch of people sailed from Palestine, and they landed in Marseille in France. And but there was also somebody named Sarah the Egyptian, who was the servant of perhaps Mary Magdalene. And she is the one who may have been black, and that's the most common theory about that. So, but when Christians discovered these black Madonnas, at first they thought it was Jesus because the image was so similar to the Madonna child. And it still could have been, perhaps. But it's the most common idea is that that was actually Sarah the Egyptian and her child. Okay. Then there's the theory that Jesus had very pale skin and red hair. And he was portrayed that way a lot in Italian paintings in the 14th century. You see a lot of the altar paintings with the pale skin, red hair, and that's based upon theories that Jesus had English blood in him. There's a whole tradition in England that he had sailed to England as a youth during his missing years, and he may have studied Druidism with his great-uncle Joseph of Arimathea, who was a mining minister. Joseph of Arimathea, as probably most of you know, is the one who helped get Jesus off the cross. He was the very wealthy uncle of Mary. And in the English traditions, Mary's mother was actually of English royal blood and actually came from England. And there was a lot of tin mining back in those days. The British Isles were used to extract tin, and they were trading with the Roman Empire. So there was a lot of trade going on. And there were a lot of Jews that were in the tin mines of England at the time. So it's not inconceivable that Joseph of Arimathea, who was a top Jewish leader, could also have had connections to England. And hence, Jesus could have come from that background. Again, to me, what a person looks like, the color of the skin, to me doesn't matter at all. And in fact, that's one point I make in the book, is like Jesus himself never says anything about, whether your skin color makes any difference to your spiritual state. It doesn't. To me, it's mostly significant for maybe exploring what he taught and what he believed, because if he was English and the Druids were the ones who controlled English religion and theology back then, if he studied under them, again, we get a very different theology. That means that Jesus may have taught something very different than what we're taught in the New Testament. So that, to me, is the most significant thing about that evidence. Yes?
Isn't there some kind of account by Josephus, who is a contemporary historian, that depicted Jesus as being red hair, and that there was like a big description? It seems like I read that somewhere.
Okay, yeah, the question was, did Josephus talk about Jesus having red hair and about a description? I think you're thinking of the letter of Publius Lentulus. I'm sorry, I'm messing that name up. There was and in fact, I quote the whole letter in my book. There was a letter, it's an apocryphal letter. It wasn't by Josephus. It was by a man who was said to have been an old Roman governor who wrote an entire description of Jesus in a lot of detail. And it showed him as having red hair, being tall, about 6 feet. The description is very similar to the image you see in the Shroud of Turin. Okay. And so some people think, well, maybe that's where the description came from, was somebody seeing the Shroud of Turin and writing it, or it could have been something that came from a whole different track. Anyway. And the Shroud of Turin is also a very interesting artifact. It kind of gets into also what did he look like. Because some people who believe that the Shroud of Turin is real, of course, say, well, there it is. He's 6 feet tall. He had certain features. He had long hair. He had a beard, and all of that. I get quite a bit into in analyzing the Shroud of Turin in the book. I try to keep up to date on the scholarship. It's changing all the time, as you know. Somebody, at least once a month, comes out with a new theory about it. So probably by the time you read my description of it, somebody else has come out with something new. To me, the Shroud of Turin is very interesting. I don't know what to think of it myself, to be honest with you, after having looked into it. The main controversy to me about the Shroud of Turin is, okay, if it's real, if it really was his burial cloth, what that means is that Jesus did not die on the cross. And that may be the reason why the Catholic Church has not quite come out and said, we believe this to be real, It's true, they have it in their cathedral at Turin. It's venerated by Catholics all over the world, but the Vatican has not quite come out and said this is his burial cloth. And the reason for that is because the Shroud of Turin shows that the body was actively bleeding at the time that the shroud was wrapped around it. And if it was actively beating, that means if it was actively bleeding, it means that the heart was beating. And if the heart was beating, it means he wasn't dead when he was wrapped in the shroud. And so that's become quite a controversy. So if the Shroud of Turin is real, it proves probably, well, it comes pretty close to proving he was real. There's another theory that it may have been Jacques de Molay, the head of the Templars, that he may have been the one who was wrapped in the shroud, and he was just crucified the same way as Jesus as a form of torture. Not a bad theory, come to think of it, because the shroud appeared just shortly, sometime after that. And the carbon-14 test on the shroud dates it to right about that time that Molay was executed. On the other hand, there's disputes about whether the carbon-14 dating was accurate. There's talk about bioplastic coating, all these things. It makes my head spin. And I'm throwing out a lot of stuff at you right now. And what I'll try to do, I'll kind of throw it all out at you, and then you just kind of ask me, we can kind of slow down a little bit and get into the theories that are the most interesting to you. And so that kind of gets into I'm skipping ahead now, that gets into the theory of, did Jesus really die on the cross? The Muslims believe that he did not die. The wife of Muhammad, in fact, wrote that he lived to old age and that he lived to be 120. And then, as some of you may know, there's a tomb in Kashmir that may have been Jesus' tomb. At least some people think it was his tomb, because he would have fled there to avoid persecution by the Romans again if he had survived, and he lived there to be old age. One description from that time and from that place kind of showed him to be kind of bitter at the end. Like he lived out the rest of his life in kind of a bitter mode. And so I get into all the theories about where he may have died and where he may have traveled, and again, the evidence for each of those different theories. Then, let's see here, then we get into what he looked like, his marital status. This is really popular right now because of the DaVinci Code. So I'm plugging my book because of the DaVinci Code right now. That's the hook I'm trying to use. Even though to me it's not the most interesting theory. Well, I shouldn't say that. It is actually kind of interesting. I do talk about the things like Holy Blood, Holy Grail. Probably a lot of you have read that, and of course I include a summary of that and those ideas. One thing I was telling you two about, I think, I was talking to a couple of people, is that he also may have had a son. And the character of Barabbas, you remember when Jesus was crucified and they had to choose between either we're going to crucify Jesus or we're going to crucify this guy named Barabbas. Well, Barabbas, they used to call him Jesus Barabbas in old versions of the New Testament. Barabbas means son of the Father. And so they were actually calling him Son of Jesus. It was his original title. And so the theory goes is that was actually his son, and that he had actually had a son when he was in his mid to late teens. And back in those days, people were having children. They were getting married and having children back at that age. So by the time Jesus was maybe in his 30s, which is about when he was getting crucified, if he'd had a son, his son would have been in his mid to late teens. And at that age, people were already joining armies, they were getting married, they were joining insurrections. So he could have had a son who kind of, like father, like son, who was going out and being an insurrectionist. And so they grabbed his kid. This is just a theory, but I like it because it kind of moves me. So they grab his kid and they say, well, we've got your son now, and you pick. Either you're going to die or your son's going to die. And it explains a little bit the mystery of why he gave himself up. Because before then, when his life was in danger from the Romans or anybody, he would go to Galilee, which was kind of a safe region. This time he didn't. This time he just stuck around and just said, okay, come and arrest me. Now, of course, the Bible says it's because the angel told him to do that, and he knew that was his mission, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just sort of very moved by the idea that that wasn't all that there was to it, that they actually had his son. and that he was ready to kind of give up his life to save his own son. And that became the trade-off. Now, it may be that he survived anyway, but the fact that he was willing to trade his life to save his son, I think, is a very moving theory. But again, it's a theory. And then also, the more common theory, popularized by the DaVinci Code, is that he, of course, had at least one daughter, maybe two daughters. And that was by Mary of Magdalene. And that was a child he would have had when he was already in his 30s, closer to the time that he was being crucified. So he could have had a teenage son as well as an infant daughter. And then after he's crucified, Mary Magdalene and everybody else goes to France, and that's where she gives birth. And then all the French royalty believe that they're descended from Mary Magdalene, and that's been one of their traditions. Okay, then we get into probably the most controversial theory in the book, and this is where I've been catching a lot of trouble, is that with the gay movement, there's a theory that Jesus was gay, and that the beloved disciple was actually his lover. And there's actually scholars who believe that. And the theory behind that, too, is that also the bisexual Christ, that yes, he was married, had a lover in Mary Magdalene, had children, but in the Greek culture, and the Greek culture really permeated Palestine at that time. When Alexander the Great invaded and took over that whole region, the Hellenistic culture was really part of Palestine, and it became part of the Roman Empire. And back then, it was very common for men to be married, to have children, but also to have a young male lover. And so the theory is that Jesus, that was the relationship between Jesus and the beloved disciple. And the beloved disciple may have been Lazarus as opposed to John. That gets into a whole nother theory. And when I first heard that theory, it was a friend of mine who actually had started a, believe it or not, a gay fundamentalist church. Yeah. And he came to me and he said, first of all, he said to me, I don't think, first of all, the Bible does not condemn homosexuality at all. And then he said to me, and that Jesus was gay. I thought, oh, well, okay. So I went out and I bought like the parallel, this was before I got into really writing the book. I went and I bought the Parallel Bible, which has all 4 major English versions of the Bible side by side. And the NIV, so I had 5 versions of the Bible. And the passages that, the fundamentalist Christians say condemns homosexuality, I looked those up. And sure enough, I mean, it really condemns it. I mean, I don't know how you can possibly say it doesn't. And then he said, well, okay, that's not true. When you look at the original Greek in the New Testament and the original Hebrew, it doesn't. What it's condemning is temple prostitution, which back in those days happened to be homosexual in nature. So I went out and he pointed me to a couple of scholars who've been saying this, and I guess it's a growing idea, is that, so I looked it up. I looked up the original Greek words, and God darn, he was right, It's temple prostitution that it was condemning. And it happened to be homosexual in nature, so they expanded it. And then he pointed out that there's actually a prophecy that some of the main Old Testament characters appear to be gay, like David and Jonathan. Some of the main prophets of the Hebrews actually seem to be that way. And that there's actually, in Isaiah, there's a prophecy about how when the church is united, God is going to have eunuchs lead the church, the unified church. And the eunuchs, and David's my friend, he pointed out, the eunuchs cannot possibly be physically castrated people because it says that the physically blemished people will never be leaders in God's church. It can only mean psychological units. And when you look at like some of the books about like the story of Daniel, when they talk about Daniel having love from the eunuch was obviously a sexual kind of relationship. So he comes up with this theory, which actually is starting to grow in the gay community, that God intends to actually call gay people, and therefore this whole thing about keeping gays out is actually Satan's plan to keep them out of the churches to prevent God's plan from being fulfilled. Okay. Whole new twist on this whole thing. And that there's also one passage in the Bible that seems to support gay marriage. So I got very interested in this because this is a hot topic right now. You know, I mean, the people are saying that this whole thing about gay marriage and gays in the church may have influenced this whole last election. So, you know, to me, it's very timely, and so of course I write about that. So that's probably the most controversial chapter, and there's some. I've done a few radio interviews on this book already, and some of them just won't touch this topic. That's okay. And okay, so we get into that. Then we get into, okay, Jesus, the man of uncertain death. I think I talked about that. Did he die? Did he survive? What happened to him afterwards? I personally tend to think he did survive. And to me, the New Testament is the strongest evidence of that, because the New Testament talks about how Pilate was so surprised that Jesus was only on the cross a few hours. And they were saying he was dead. It usually took people about 2 days to die on the cross. It was a slow, painful way of dying. And the reason why they would break people's legs is to get them to die really fast. You know, they would suffocate because of the weight. But it's very clear in the New Testament they didn't break his legs. So how could he have been dead already after just a few hours? And so the people who support the idea that he survived point to that as some of the strongest evidence. Now, there is that one passage in John where it says he got the lance wound. And so some people think, well, the lance wound is what killed him because he got the blood in the water, and that might have been a punctured heart. But maybe it didn't. And then I also talk about the tomb in Kashmir, which gets to the missing years, of course. During his missing years, he may have gone to Asia, get into all of that stuff. There's been a big controversy about the Onadovich and his writing. You know, it's been debunked, but, you know, it's really not that bad. And I really kind of get into analyzing that. And I think it holds up because there was another person who went there and also reported some of the same texts. So we have this whole tradition about him going to Asia. This is probably, most of you know this one. This is not going to be surprising to any of you here. But I give you a little bit more ammo on that one. And but to me, what the significance of that is that Jesus comes across as a very highly educated man. And that, to me, started showing maybe part of the reason why he's had such a big impact. I mean, he really was very well educated. And part of the evidence for that is that there's a passage in Luke where he's in the temple, in the Jewish temple, and causing commotion. And then he's reading from Scripture. He's actually reading from Scripture and arguing. And what that tells you is, see, literacy was very low in those days. The number of people who could actually read was very low. And that's why probably he went out and taught verbally, and why it took so long really to get the Gospels written was simply because there weren't that many people to read these things, because the literacy was very high. And the fact that Jesus could read from something and actually argue it shows that he had been educated. And this is very controversial to Christians, because there's that one passage that says, where people are saying, how could he be so intelligent without having been educated? Well, he kind of comes back with this ambivalent response in the New Testament. I believe he was very highly educated, and I think that's part of the reason for why he had such a lasting impact on the world. Okay, we're getting near the end of the theories here, and there's, of course, a lot of little sub-theories I'm not even touching on, and I won't get into those. One of the theories is that, the ancient astronaut theory. This is, I talk about it in The Gods of Eden. In this book, I devote a whole chapter, and there's a lot. I present a lot more of the apocryphal writings, the quotes showing the taxi service that he had and the apostles had, and they're being flown back and forth. There's a lot more of that kind of writing even outside the Bible. And some of it is very hard to find, so I put it in there, and you can actually read those quotations. And that, too, kind of solidified that idea. As people who've read my first book know, I take UFOs very seriously. And I do think it's a real phenomenon. And so it's very interesting to me to kind of get into more of all of these writings that support that in connection to the Jesus ministry and to the Old Testament. The one thing that really got me interested on that was how many of you have read, like, the books of Enoch? Okay, we've got a few people here. The book, most people are interested in the books of Enoch because it talks about Enoch, who's a typical abduction scenario. He's in bed, these entities come in, he's taken up, and he says he's flown to the stars, and he's shown certain things. He's given these apocalyptic messages. He's taken back, and then he teaches them. It's the pattern that we've seen for centuries and centuries, and it's still going on in some of the abductee phenomena today. What's interesting about Enoch is that he talks about being taken to this area, and there's a lot of UFO activity, and they call them clouds in those writings. Whenever you see a cloud, they're often circular, there are entities inside them piloting them around. So we're basically talking about UFOs. They just didn't call them that, they called them clouds. Anything that moved in the sky to people back then was a cloud. All right. So he talks about how he's taken to this place, so all these clouds, and there's tens, thousands times 10,000s of people, and he's taken to this big bright light, and the light communicates with him. It's starting to sound like near-death experiences, right? And he's told by the people who take him there that this is where all the souls go from Earth after they die. And then he's taken to this containment area where all of these souls are in this just horrible nightmare, kind of this nightmarish containment. And that's pretty much the end of the scenario. So to me, that was just fascinating because it so closely resembles the abduction scenarios we have today, the being of light that people see at near-death experiences, and it's all connected to UFOs in his scenario in the Book of Enoch. And so it seems to be some kind of soul processing operation. And so he talks about, and so it's interesting, you know, the evidence of reincarnation in connection with that is very interesting because UFOs, of course, they're infamous for inducing amnesia in people as part of the UFO abduction scenario. So we kind of get all that together, and that to me was very, very interesting in reading the Book of Enoch. Actually, there are two of them. And the implications from the point of Jesus is that did Jesus know? Was there something about this that he was connected to? And now we get into these stories about Jesus having been taken to different places, like he was being seen by Apostle Paul, you know, long after the crucifixion, after he arose. Was he being flown around in UFOs? Was he sort of part of this whole scenario? And of course, Paul says he met Jesus. And then you have the Book of Mormon that says that Jesus came to America after this great cataclysm, which sounds like a nuclear holocaust. And all of a sudden, Jesus appears, and he preaches to people there. And again, it's you get the UFO phenomena there too, as well as the high-tech possible, you know, the nuclear holocaust kind of scenario. Now, Mormons believe that it was actually a combination of volcano and earthquake. There's certain things about it that don't fit that. They really fit a sudden attack, the flashes of light, the nuclear winter, and then all of a sudden there's Jesus sometime after that talking to the survivors. And then I talk about all the traditions of Jesus appearing in different places. And some of them are probably, you know, we can kind of throw those out, but it's interesting. So was Jesus being flown around? And then this is what some people theorize, is that Jesus was kind of being flown around, place after place. And continuing to preach kind of this UFO-type message. And then I thought, well, how does that really fit in then with the idea that he traveled to maybe England after his survival to escape the Roman persecution, possibly having a tomb in Kashmir? Do the two hang together? And they do kind of, even that hangs together amazingly, because if you look at what happens with abductees and contactees today, they're rarely taken for long periods of time. You'll find, and very often, that their contacts diminish. And that would appear to be the case too here, if this is true of Jesus, that he was being taken around in UFOs, that like contactees today and throughout history, he just went on to live a normal life after it was finally over. And I don't think he was maybe that much different than other contactees and abductees. So that becomes that conclusion. And then we get another very controversial theory, and this is the last one, I promise you, is was he a psychopath? Was Jesus mentally ill? Was this just a guy running around just following the religious delusions of his day, and they were just all a bunch of really nutcases. And back in the 19th century, when psychiatry was becoming very popular, they used to like to do historical psychiatry, where they would go ahead and they would analyze historical figures. And one of the favorite subjects was Jesus. They just loved to analyze Jesus. And Albert Schweitzer wrote this book, The Search for the Historical Jesus. And he summarizes some of these theories, some of these psychiatrists had about Jesus, that he was mentally ill. They even put labels on him, and it sounded like psychiatric evaluation today. And then I get into, too, like, and some people say, well, look at what Christianity has done. I mean, gosh, it's caused so much war. You look at the Inquisition, you look at the Crusades, the cruelty. Even look at today, you know, you get some of these Christians who are supporting Bush, the Dominionists. They want to bring back the Old Testament. I mean, it's scary in a way. You know, they want death by stoning. They want slavery to come back. They want our civil law taken away, and we go back to biblical law. And you think, you know, what kind of people are these? And, you know, what kind of person would inspire that is the theory. What kind of person would he's quoted as saying, you know, you should hate your father, you should hate your mother, you should hate your family, follow me and hate everybody except me. And that's in there. You say, well, what kind of religious preacher is this? I mean, this guy is nuts. And then you look at some of the apocryphal writings about his infancy. He was a cruel kid. He was killing other kids, you know, for just, you know, just bumping them. You know, one kid was thrown off a roof, and the townspeople were saying to his father, you got to take your kid out of town because he's killing the kids. We don't want you in town. You know, what kind of person was this? And so I have a whole chapter on that theory. But I resurrect Jesus a bit from that, partly because the quote about hating your parents, that I've come to bring war, not peace, he's quoted as saying that. Those appear to be mistranslations, because in one of them especially, every English translation I have seen, and I can't believe this, and I know that I'm not the biblical scholar here. I know that these people have read this Bible and have studied it, including the original Latin. But when he talks about, I've come to bring the sword and not peace, when you look at the original Greek, the passage begins with the word notwithstanding. And it's right in there. And it changes the entire meaning. What it means is that, okay, I've got 5 minutes. What it means is that even though we are carrying swords, even though you see us with swords, don't think we have come to bring war, to turn father against son. The whole meaning's changed by that one word. And why? Okay, maybe somebody's going to point that out to me. You know, some guy from Harvard's going to write to me and say, well, this is why you're wrong about that. But I've looked at it and looked at it and looked at it, and suddenly it makes sense, because the rest of Matthew, where he talks about the blessed are the peacekeepers, suddenly makes sense. There's a total contradiction. And so I came to the conclusion, I think more scholars are, is that the versions of the New Testament that we read today are horribly mistranslated in a lot of ways. And so we have this very schizophrenic theology going on. And I'm sorry if I have Christians in the audience, but this is my opinion. It's a very schizophrenic, very split personality type of theology that's going on. And a lot of it has to do with these mistranslations. Okay, I'm going to try to do the very last thing. The Jesus and the second coming. People were asking me, okay, what about Jesus and the second coming? What about the rapture? What about this? I wasn't even going to include that. And, but I researched it by popular demand, okay? And when I read what Jesus actually, I think, you know, the interpretation that I think is the best of what he actually taught, not what Book of Revelation teaches. Book of Revelation was added a lot later. Even a lot of the early Christians didn't believe in Book of Revelation. It kind of just got in by the skin of its teeth. But when you look at what Jesus is actually quoted as saying in the New Testament, it's very different. And I actually, at that point, I actually gained a lot of respect, because what he seems to be saying, and I like this interpretation, whether it's true or not, but he says that before God's kingdom comes, and cut me off, by the way, I know I've only got a minute or two. What he's quoted as saying is before the God's kingdom comes, the Spirit of truth will arrive. The Holy Spirit's going to arrive. And he says a couple places that I am not the one who has brought you the whole path to salvation. I am not the one who has taught you everything. And he says that right there. Christians are saying that the Bible teaches them everything they need to know about salvation. That's not what Jesus says. He says, I haven't taught you everything. He says that to the disciples. It's very clear. This is not just some translation. It's very clear, even in the English translations. He says, that's going to come later, after I'm gone. And before that comes, the Holy Spirit's going to come. Holy Spirit is generally interpreted to mean Spirit of truth, meaning truth will arrive. And when truth arrives, then there's going to be some kind of epiphany. And when that epiphany happens, when all truth arrives, we are all going to be wise. And that's when God's kingdom is going to come. And that makes so much sense all of a sudden. There's no rapture. Well, the only rapture that Jesus sort of teaches is that bad people will be taken off the earth, not good people.
Which gospel is that?
I quote it in there. I'm sorry, I don't know. It's quoted in my book, chapter and verse. I'm not going to try to tell you because I don't have the book in front of me, but it's in there. Okay. So and to me, you can be a secular person and not believe in anything. I think we can all agree that if truth arrives, if a spirit of truth really permeates the society, politicians, preachers, lawyers, I'm one of those, if that really permeates, of course we're going to have a utopian society. That in itself will bring kind of a utopia. And that seems to be what Jesus was preaching. So this very down-to-earth kind of road to utopia. And all this stuff about rapture, I'm thinking, that's based upon this book of Revelation and all of this type of stuff. And to me, it's kind of crazy. So I think at that point, did I think Jesus was a good person or a bad person, getting down to those simple things? When I finally researched that, I'm glad people pushed me to research it. Because when I read that, I thought, yeah, Jesus was okay. Okay, time for a break, and then we can do questions and answers.
Are we on here? One of the most interesting interpretations I ever saw of the whole Jesus thing was in the Urantia book, where it was like mass hypnosis type of a thing, where they produced this sort of mass illusion kind of deal. Did you happen to get into that? Are you familiar with the book of Urantia at all?
I've heard of it. I may even have it in my library, but
it's a huge book, and one of the most weird, interesting books I've ever read that has very probably spurious origins, but I suspect. But how people come up with stuff like this, I have no idea, even if it was spurious. But anyway, that's just a fascinating interpretation of the life of Jesus, that it was basically a mass hallucination. Particularly the crucifixion, I think that was the part in particular they were referring to.
I've heard that theory from secular sources. I didn't get too much into drawing from theories like from channeled sources and things like that. Not because there aren't some good ideas. I mean, I've read channeled works that have some really interesting ideas, so it's not because of that. What I tried to do, though, is I tried to focus more on the actual, like, New Testament, the Gnostic Gospels, things like that. So I've heard that theory, but I don't include it. And that might be the reason why. Yes?
I'm sure you're familiar with Carl Jung.
Sure.
And Jesus is an archetype. And gay Jesus, all these varieties, it's because he's an archetype of the self, what Jung calls the self. And that's why he impresses all of us, his children. Jesus loves me. We take that into our heart.
Uh-huh.
But he is an archetype. And that's why he impresses you, impresses me, impresses all of us. And also he takes all this myriad forms. But he is real. He's real in our heart. I mean, there are different kinds of reality. Psychically, he's very real.
Uh-huh.
And he's powerful.
Yeah.
He's very real.
Okay. Yeah, that's here's one thing I can never deny is the impact that the concept of Jesus has on people. And that's a little bit, I think, what you're talking about, that the archetype, you're right, it has resonance for a lot of people. And a lot of people, of course, tend to create Jesus in their own image, in a sense. And I think there's for example, you get some scholars, especially Christian scholars, who say there's the Jesus of faith and there's the Jesus of history. And it's funny because some Catholic scholars who they wear the collar and all that, they're willing to talk about all of this very historical stuff, like any other scholar. And I was actually kind of amazed at how liberal some Catholics can be about all of this. But then they will still believe in Jesus the way the Bible says at the same time.
Yeah, that's a mind blower.
It is. And one of these days I've got to talk to one of them and really understand what that is, because I think you're right. There's something that resonates that seems to be very important to people, but it doesn't really quite match perhaps the historical person. And how do we reconcile that? I'm not quite sure how we do that.
There's so many ways of interpreting the Bible. I mean, we can see it metaphorically, allegorically, cosmically. I mean, there's just myriad interpretations of the Bible.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I tended to focus, I guess maybe it is because of my legal training. I kind of want to get down to the nuts and bolts, and here's the facts, and which is not always the best approach to religion. I'll have to admit that. Yeah, right. Right. Although even despite that, it's funny. What convinces me is that about the reality of the soul and metaphysical things are scientific studies. Like the evidence for reincarnation. There's a professor over in the University of Virginia, Ian Stevenson, who has just trekked mostly to India, and he's just compiled this massive amount of quantity of just stories. I'm persuaded by that, and that kind of anchors me, so I can kind of go off now with this in hand. I can kind of go off and believe these things because I think it's anchored in some scientific, academic type evidence. I'm not saying that necessarily we should have to anchor it in things like that. I think faith, belief has some value beyond just what you can prove in an academic sense. And sometimes that might be truer than what you can prove academically. That just happens to be where I come from. And so when you read what I write, you kind of have to live with it. But I understand that that's not the only approach to take to religion in these questions. Yes, you had a question there.
Yeah, I'm just curious, unless I misheard what you were saying about the ET aspect, it was more like he would be an abductee. Not so much that he himself would be an extraterrestrial, but that he was an abductee. And one of the reasons I'm asking, I don't know if you've read The God Hypothesis by Joe Lewis.
I haven't read that, no.
Oh, such a good book.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know if I read this in there, but the whole concept of the virgin birth, Mary, visitation, there's a lot of ET, a lot of women are taken aboard ships and then I have friends who've actually had pregnancies that couldn't have happened that then disappeared, and just strange things. I was just wondering if your approach is that he is an ET person or just a human who had ET experiences.
I've been asked that, and that's an interesting question. He doesn't. First, there's no description anywhere, either in the New Testament or in the Apocrypha, that makes him look like a hybrid. Let me put it that way. Today, like in the research of Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs, what we are seeing and hearing from abductees is the baby that comes out looks half human, half ET, and they can see that, right? Am I catching that, or am I getting that wrong?
With hybrids?
Yeah. Yeah, okay. In other words, you can kind of see that they're different. There's nothing that I have read that points to anybody remarking on that about Jesus. And I actually looked for it, too. When I was looking at the theories about what he looked like, I was actually kind of looking to see if there might be something like that, and I didn't find anything. So I kind of came to the conclusion is that, yes, if he was artificially inseminated, it was not to create a hybrid. It was just to create another human being, like the same way we breed cows. And I talk about this in The Gods of Eden. It's very offensive to some people. But how we breed cows, we want more perfect cows, and so we artificially inseminate them. We're not creating any kind of hybrids. In some sense we are, but we're creating just better brands of cows, the same kind of cow. And I kind of look at Jesus that way, that if he was artificially inseminated, it was more to create a better human being physically. Because, like I said, I didn't find any descriptions like that in there. And so, therefore, I would analogize him more to being in the realm of an abductee or a contactee as opposed to an ET who's flying around.
I I was thinking more of his powers more than his physical appearance, because he did have special powers. So.
It depends on what you believe in those powers. Yeah, there's some people who don't believe he had special powers. There are other people who think that he did, that the reports of healing, they may have been prosaic. Yes, he may have done miraculous healings, but they may have been rather prosaic explanations for it. In other words, he was an outstanding healer. Like I said, the evidence that he was highly educated, I think, is there. And the Essenes were taught the healing arts. He may have been an outstanding healer, maybe the best of his day. That may help describe or explain why he had so much success with that. On the other hand, the people who think he had higher powers, yeah, if you believe that we are souls and that we're capable of ESP and things like that, maybe there is some spiritual dimension going on too that brings about some of these healings too. I personally don't think that Jesus was a magical being. So that's where maybe, I tend to think he was a human being, but a fairly exceptional one, and a fairly complex one. Yes?
Hi. I'm new to your work. I'm about a third of the way through Gods of Eden.
Oh, thank you.
But what drew me to come is twofold, really. One is that personally, I've always felt a strong response to Christ and to the Divine Mother, even though I'm not a Christian, practicing Christian. But based on past lives, I think, I have a very strong pull that direction. And what drew me to your work was around the role of the UFOs, because I've been a student of a program called Steps to Knowledge by Marshall Summers. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with that work?
No, I'm not.
You mentioned Bud Hopkins, so that's someone who is, but it addresses the whole question of the abductions that are taking place and sees it as a potential threat, obviously, to human freedom. And so they talk about that the intervention is mainly through a manipulation of the mental environment. And the way this ties to Christ is they said that they could easily orchestrate a second coming of Christ, and that would be a very dangerous thing. And when you look at like the movie that Mel Gibson made recently, it almost seemed like that was possibly in the works. So it seemed to me important for all of us to try to access what is true in the situation and not just what we want to believe, Yeah,
that's a very good point. And that's why I think it's so important now, too, that we try to get to the truth of things, whatever it may be. In some ways, the truth may be more surprising than what we think. Because I think until we really know what it is, you're right, we can be manipulated by concepts that are not based on truth, by being told something is truth, so we follow it, we find out it's not, but by then it's too late. Yeah, and one thing I talk about in Gods of Eden is that we've had a number of totally apocalyptic eras in human history, where all the elements of an apocalypse happen. Massive death, like the Black Plague year. We have a lot of UFO phenomena going on back during the Black Death. Millions of people dying, a quarter of the population dying. Weird religions coming up, people preaching, okay, the apocalypse is here. The only thing that doesn't happen is we don't get the 1,000 years of peace. We get all the death, we get all the destruction, we just don't get the peace afterwards. And that's kind of the point that I make in there. And so, yeah, people are preaching now again that all the signs are coming again, and we're going to have another era like that. I can't rule out that the human race isn't going to go through that again. What I'm concerned about, and the point that I try to make, is I don't think we're going to get that 1,000 years. It'll be the same thing. We just won't get that 1,000 years of peace after it's all over, because the patterns seem to be the same. So that's why I think you're right. I think it's so important that we try to start arriving at the truth of all these things. And it's hard, I'll tell you, this book, Jesus Goes to Hollywood, obviously I try to put a little bit of light into it, make it a little bit humorous with the title and with the artwork on the cover. But it's actually a very serious book, and it really is an attempt to come out with some kind of a picture. So all I can say is, yeah, we need to keep doing it. And I certainly don't have all the answers. I mean, to me, the books that I've written are just part of my exploration, but I have so many questions still that I think are going to be very hard to answer. But I think we need to try. So.
Yeah, I think
okay.
it's weird to talk on the microphone, but anyhow, I think it's good, that you're bringing this up, because I've seen it, in the election times, how you mentioned before, and it's true, how the fundamentalist church are really trying to influence voting. They just give us pamphlets and tell us how to vote and all of that. So that's really good if there's more people out there, because it becomes like a self-fulfilled prophecy too, where you're talking about all the prophecies in the Bible with second coming of Christ and all. So that's a good thing, because at the same time, there's a faith element that you talk about, that it exists. So it's a mixture of some stuff that, it's just not, that doesn't make any sense, with some other stuff that's by faith makes sense. I personally experienced death experience. I was in a car accident and I was left unconscious. And what brought me back to life was just focus on Jesus, actually, because I was raised in a Catholic church, and I kept calling. And I remember very clearly, like, going through the space, through tunnels and lights and things, and just saying the word Jesus, 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 and coming back. So, this is a faith, but at the same time, all this other stuff around, it's pretty weird. So one connected to the other, it's very dangerous, because it's like a lot of stuff is not true and connected with faith, and it's just really weird. So that's good you're doing.
Yeah,
if more
thank
people
you.
are doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Got a couple more here.
It's up for grabs.
Well, this is, waxing philosophical here, but you almost get down with this kind of stuff, it seems like to me, to epistemology. What are your ways of ascertaining the truth, And it's like, it seems to me when it comes particularly to the life of Jesus, that there's nothing that's slipperier than that. As you pointed out, really, there's so many versions of his life, and I spent a lot of time trying to sort it out myself, and I finally came to a conclusion that, for at least as far as Jesus is concerned, and me and Jesus, it was like I just have to come to my own version of whatever is true for me about that. And because there's no outside information that I can use to absolutely, with certainty, using verifiable scientific facts, verify what I believe one way or another. And the curious thing is in a lot of ways, I think you could take that whole epistemology, that whole way of looking at it, and really apply that to almost anything, even the things we think are really solid pieces of truth, I wonder. So anyway, just my musings about that. I think it's a very slippery topic, particularly the Jesus thing.
Yeah, it is. And that's what makes it so controversial. Again, it's partly because I think that Jesus was a true historical person. And therefore, to me, that makes it worthwhile trying to find out what that historical person really did and said. The concepts of Jesus, apart from the historical person, I think maybe what you're getting into, then we can have different ideas, and that's okay. In other words, for a lot of people, Jesus is like an ideal. It's something to aspire to. And that's totally okay to do that. Was that who this person really was that ran around in Palestine 2,000 years ago? Was he actually that person? That's what I want to know. And can it be known? I don't think we can ever know for sure, because the records have been so destroyed. I mean, you have the Christian heresy hunters who wiped out a lot of the records. You have the Islamic heresy hunters who wiped out a lot of it. So the questions that I ask, I think I can agree with you on one thing. We can never come to a total truth to know exactly what it was. We can only come to approximations. But again, here you're the victim of my background, the way I tend to think and the way I want to look into things. And this is just the way I tend to want to do it, because this is what satisfies me. Because I do want to know the realities of, like I said, of where we stand spiritually. And to me, Jesus is just one little part of that, of what he may have taught. But there's nobody that I hold up as a god or anything like that, whether it's Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha or anything like that. These people, I think, were human beings, personally, but they're very important human beings. And is there genuine inspiration about God or from God? That's another question, because I also believe in a supreme being. And do we find in the Bible, even though it's written by human beings, do we find actual inspirations about God that reflect truth about God? It's perhaps we do. Because you have these people who were trying for that. They were really trying to think about what God wants, what God thinks, what God wants humanity to know. And some of that may have found its way into the Bible. I don't think all of the Bible has that at all. Like I said, you get into the issues of slavery and God saying slavery is okay. I don't think that came from any God. But there may be other things in there that did. And I can't tell you, because I can't tell you what those things are. So yeah, that leaves us kind of free then to develop some of our own ideas and to our own concepts. But anyway, you raised a good point, and you had a question.
I wonder what would have happened to Christianity if Constantine hadn't had his conversion. Has anybody written a book or anything?
Oh, well, there we go. That gets into the UFO angle again. The idea there is that the cross that Constantine saw in the sky was actually a UFO manifestation. If he hadn't had that, I think we would still have a Christianity. I don't think it would have disappeared. I think it would have been more divided. I think the Gnostic, Essene type of Christianity would have survived. I think that's the main difference we would have. We would have a sharper division. And I think the Essene Gnostic type of Christianity or belief has reemerged like in the New Age. And that's where we're seeing it kind of come back. And of course, Christ is part of that. A lot of the New Age beliefs incorporate Christ into that type of paradigm. So I think in some ways, some of the New Age is a reemergence, like Pope Paul lamented, is actually a reemergence of Gnosticism to some extent, which incorporates Christ into the belief system. Okay, yes.
I've always been interested in the theory that Jesus lived his last days in India. Mm-hmm. Did you ever read the book, Jesus Lived in India, Lived and Died in India?
I did, yeah, and I looked at that.
Did you talk about that tonight?
I did, yeah.
I'm sorry I came in late.
Yeah, no, not a problem. There are a number of paths that he could have taken. Obviously, if he's been crucified and he survives, he's going to want to skip town pretty fast.
Yeah.
Because he's not going to wait around, because you can bet if the Romans picked him up again, they're going to make sure he's really dead. They're not going to take none of this silly hanging on the cross stuff anymore. They're going to cut his head off or do something. So of course, if he survives, he's going to flee, and his supporters are going to take it. They're going to make sure he gets out of Palestine. And so there are a number of traditions, that he may have gone with Mary Magdalene and the group to France, and that he may have also gone as far as the British Isles, where his great uncle Joseph of Arimathea already had contacts. The question is, did he die there? And there's no traditions of actually Jesus dying in either France or in England, even though there are a little bit of traditions he may have gone there after his death. The only tradition I could find about where he actually died are two places: Kashmir, and that's the one I think you're talking about, and Japan. There's actually a tomb for Jesus in Japan. Now, don't get too excited about the tomb in Japan, because it looks like it's pretty much a phony thing just to lure tourists, because they also said that Moses went to Japan, and that's where he got the 10 Commandments and the Star of David from the Japanese emperor. And so I mean, if you go to Japan and you want to visit it just for fun, go. I don't take that one too seriously. But I put it in the book, but I kind of let you know that I don't take it too seriously. But the one in Kashmir, the tomb, it's called Rosabal. That one, yeah, I have to say that it's pretty intriguing. And in fact, you can go online if you, there's actually a website just devoted to that one tomb, and they have pictures of it and all that, and it's actually kind of neat. It's pretty interesting.
And they also showed Mary's grave there, too. I think they have
I think
one
nearby, right. Now, Mary Magdalene, her remains have been in different places. They also said she may have died in France. Mother Mary, there are about 3 different tombs for her, so we're not quite sure where those people have lived. But you're right, there is a tomb in that direction for Mary. Yes?
I just get a quick question. I just thumbed through this book real quick. When I came in here with you, I was speaking earlier. I thought you had said that you were going to talk about his teachings. Now, if you didn't, did you leave that for the book?
I did. I get more into it in the book. I explore the Gnostic beliefs versus the Pauline beliefs and how they differ and what the implications are for Christianity, that if the Gnostic beliefs were really what he taught, it's a whole different path to salvation, what the Christian church is teaching. And I talk about how that was the big battle, and of course scholars acknowledge that that was the big battle that almost tore apart Christianity. And also how that relates to the Essenes, and also the Cynics. There's another theory that Jesus belonged to the sect of the Cynics. I didn't mention that earlier, but that's also in there. They also had similar ideas about the relationship of the soul in regard to the body and the universe. So every sect that he may have been part of, the Gnostics. Oh, and I also talk about the Mandeans, who were like the ancestors of not the ancestors, but the carriers of the Gnostic beliefs. They believe that Jesus was just a crummy guy, but they also believe that he did belong to their sect, but he betrayed their sect. But then the Mandeans are also very Gnostic, and they still exist today. You can find them in San Diego. They're not very big anymore. They're in Iran, and they're a very interesting group too. They wear the white clothing, at least they used to, but now they're becoming modernized, of course. So yeah, I do get more into that in the book, but that's not totally what the book's about, but I get into those implications. I could talk for an hour about that in a talk like this, and of course today is kind of a summary of the different theories.
No, that's fine. I mean, I bought the book. I'll go home and read it.
Okay.
I just want to know if it was in it.
Yeah, it is. There is more in there.
Secondly, I just wanted to make a point of what's been interesting, that we all know science has been skewed over many years. Now the Bible has been skewed, a lot of skepticism, but we keep on searching for the truth. Well, maybe we should just look at ourselves like the gentleman just said over there in the blue shirt, that what we believe, through our own wisdom. Because I don't think we'll ever find the truth by searching, okay? Because a lot of your research, and I respect your work, but my conclusion is I think we just use our own innate wisdom, and I think the truth sits there.
Okay, that's a good note to end on, and that's 8:30, and they're going to want to get us out of here by 9. So let me just comment very briefly on that. Yeah, I think the most important thing is what you believe. And for me, I'm obviously searching for an objective truth outside of my belief system. And so in that search, I then form subjective beliefs as a result of what I think the objective evidence might be. But on the other hand, you get to the point, too, where there is an inner wisdom. And I have found that some people have said these things to me that are very wise without saying to me, well, here's the evidence for this, and here's the evidence for that, and here's the evidence for that. And, and it resonates with me. And then later on, all of a sudden, some piece of objective evidence might come along that sort of supports that. And so, yeah, I think that what you're talking about, the internal wisdom and cultivating that, I think that's very important. I think also that's often how even objective discoveries are made, because we can develop an internal wisdom, and then as we're kind of looking around the world, we see the signs that it might be true, like the world can confirm it to us in some ways. It doesn't necessarily have to, but sometimes it does. So yeah, the pattern of always looking for the evidence like on this table or out there in that book is not always the best approach. I think there's the balance there. I'm a little bit unbalanced that way, so I'll admit that to you. But your approach, I think, is something that people should cultivate as well. Okay, I know that they want us to close at 9, so we'll go ahead and end the session here. Thanks so much for coming, and I really enjoyed your questions.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.